Hi, and welcome to another episode of Ends Division, where we're going to talk about debt and default and debt ceilings and all kinds of other, mostly actually fairly scary stuff with our guest, Megan McArdle. Megan McArdle is the business and economics editor at The Atlantic and a long-term libertarian econo blogger, and I believe is listed in Guinness as the world's tallest female econo blogger as well. I've heard that rumor anyway. But we're glad to have you here, Megan. Thanks for joining us via the miracle of Skype.
Thank you for having me via the miracle of Skype. It is indeed miraculous.
It really is. It really is. Well, here we are. There's all this talk about a debt deal, about hitting the debt ceiling, about the possibility of default. And my first instinct is to assume that this is all the usual Washington brinksmanship and blather and build up for negotiating positions. But more and more people seem to think that we may actually just not have a deal. Is that right? Is there a real risk that we could hit the debt ceiling next month and that would be it?
You know, I think at this point we don't know because a really tough negotiating stance. At this point, the Republicans are sort of using the Tea Party as like Mel Gibson and Lethal Weapon. Like, they're crazy. We don't know what they'll do. So you should give us everything we want. And we don't know if that's actually just a negotiating position or if they really mean it, that they're just not going to move off of no revenue increases at all. But the position that's come out is things like even like ethanol tax credits, even that those cannot be used to partially pay for deficit closure. They can only be used to pay for lower taxes elsewhere. And the problem with that is that, Democrats, I think fairly, no one wants to be the person who's giving 100% of the deal. And, it's I think more broadly, it's gotten really poisonous here, and it's been going on for a long time. But at this point, I'm hearing from a lot of people who are like, look, Obamacare, you guys did this to us, now it's our turn. And you can't do a debt negotiation that way, but I'm afraid that's kind of the level of anger that's now out there.
It's funny you say that because I really think the Obamacare thing poisoned the well in the way nothing political has done in my lifetime. And in particular, I think for a lot of people, it literally broke the bond they felt to the state, that they don't feel anymore that debts that the U.S. government takes on are debts for which they have personal responsibility. And I'm not talking about people in Washington, I'm talking about taxpayers out in the country. They're like, you passed this bill, you didn't care I didn't like it. In fact, you rubbed my nose in the fact that you passed it when I didn't like it. So you want to run up the debt and bankrupt the country? Screw you, I'm just not going to pay. Default is my way of getting back at the whole political class, and I don't care what happens. Now, that's perhaps not a rational approach, but I know there are, in fact, sub-libertarians who say the worse the better, right? Like Lenin said, that's the only way. We've just got to bring the whole system down. That's not your view. I think you've called it screaming lunacy. So you want to explain why that's a bad idea?
I understand the anger totally. I mean, I was very upset when Obamacare passed, and I think that especially because it wasn't even like, the Democrats kept saying elections have consequences, but in fact, a majority of the country was against it and has consistently been. And so I totally understand the frustration and the anger of feeling like, okay, you guys raised taxes to pay for this new plan, and now we have to raise taxes again in order to pay for deficit reduction. What do we get here? That said, the consequences of a default, if Democrats do walk away, and I think that if they don't get some concessions, they will, because that's just how people are. If they feel like they're being asked to do 100% of the compromising, as we're seeing, they get very angry. The consequences of not doing it are really, I think, catastrophic. And one of two things can happen. The first is we could default, and that's really just a desperate, terrible move. And I know a lot of people think that it's a way to control spending, but I don't think that that's true. I mean, there's nothing to keep them from raiding 401ks the way Argentina did, or raising taxes more to cover the spending that they want to do. On the other hand, say we just cut spending in order to try to close it. Well, at this point, because of the recession, revenues are so low, they're abnormally low, we would have to start immediately doing pretty hefty cuts to things like Social Security. Well, if you do that, a mob of angry seniors is going to descend on Washington. They're going to vote Democrats in a landslide, and then the Democrats are just going to undo it. I don't think there's any substitute. No matter how much I understand the anger, there is no substitute for a bipartisan deal here. And that's going to mean the Republicans are going to have to give something up, no matter how unfair they feel it is.
Well, actually, there have been a few people coming out and making, Steve Hayward was over on Powerline making what he calls the conservative case for higher taxes. And what he says is you need to really jack up taxes on the middle and working classes and make them feel the pain too if you want long-term control of spending. And that what you've got to do is, in fact, to make our tax system a lot less progressive, because right now the vast majority of taxes are paid by a relatively small percentage of the population. Do you think the Republicans have it within them to come back with an offer like that and make the Democrats either take it or leave it?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the power of people like Grover Norquist, who has basically made everyone in Congress sign a pledge that they will not raise any tax revenue whatsoever. Yeah, I mean, voters are, as I think you and I have both blogged about, they're rationally uninformed. They don't pay a lot of attention to politics because they've got better things to do. And so, they just sort of know when Grover Norquist tells them that someone has raised taxes, they either like it or they don't. And so he's got a tremendous amount of power to set the limits of what legislators are allowed to do. And I think that what I agree, actually, is that it needs to be painful to raise spending. It shouldn't feel free, which is what you get when you borrow. But I think getting Republicans to make that deal would be really tough.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing about that pledge is it even means they can't do sort of fun things. Like if I were a Republican in Congress, I'd be saying, you want taxes? Okay, here's a 50% excise tax on movie tickets, DVDs, CDs, music downloads, everything produced by Hollywood and the entertainment industry. Because people shouldn't be going out and having a good time like this without helping to pay for the deficit. It's serious times here. Of course, Hollywood would scream and the Democrats would be torn. But you can't even do that when you've got a pledge not to do anything at all.
Exactly, 100% tariff on Volvo imports. But no, they can't. They can't go out and do anything that would do the kind of strategic things that politicians in normal times do to put their opponents in a bad position and make them put their money where their mouth is. Republicans can't do that because they're so tied by this pledge to not raise any revenue whatsoever.
Well, something I've said on my blog repeatedly, because, well, I believe it, is that I think we actually have the worst political class in the history of the Republic. And I really mean the worst in sort of every sense other than SAT scores, where we may very well have the best. But in terms of self-discipline, sort of far-sightedness, willing to sacrifice for the common good, I think we have the worst. Is our political class even up to the task of managing this kind of a problem?
I don't even know if it's that we have the worst political class. It's that 30 years ago, there were more kind of institutional checks on the crazier members of Congress from going forth. There was a lot more history in the institution. There was a lot of longevity, so people would, stay in Congress. And there are downsides to that. But the upside was that people had a lot at stake in these debates. They cared about balancing the budget because they knew that they were and their party were going to be around to worry about it if the budget deficit exploded. They cared about keeping a lid on things because there was one guy who was sitting there and looking at both sides of the balance sheet. And now what you have is a lot of people who want to propose either big spending or big tax cuts. There's no one who's taking responsibility for the entire outcome of our fiscal debate. And I think that's one of the main things that has driven us into sort of insanity land.
Yeah, well, it certainly is a mess. And I guess the only thing we can feel good about is that if you look at Europe, you see that the problem is not uniquely an American problem. That it's a lot easier for politicians generally to promise a lot more and spend a lot more than it is to pay for it. So let's shift gears here for sort of our wrap-up. Lots of people are watching this and they're like, oh my God, well, what do I do if there's a default? Now, I used to make fun of talk radio for telling people, it's a good time to buy gold because it was always a good time to buy gold. Maybe now they're right. But leaving aside sort of the gold coins and shotgun shells approach, do you have any advice to people on how they ought to approach the prospect of a financial collapse or meltdown in the federal government over the next few months?
Don't get a job with the federal government. Don't buy treasury bonds would be the two things. I mean, I think that eventually, I think it's unlikely that we would, seriously default the way Argentina did and just decide we're going to pay everyone 30 cents on the dollar. But it could certainly be a chaotic time in the markets for the next few months. And so you might want to stay in cash, stay on the sidelines, and just see what happens. But other than that, I mean, I really don't think anyone has any idea what's going to happen. This is so unprecedented, and unprecedented not just in America. It's unprecedented because in most cases, you don't worry about risking either default or government shutdown because two parties in the government just can't agree on anything. But that's really the position we're in now.
Well, that's not very cheerful. Okay, final question. You wrote in The Atlantic a while back, and we actually talked on this show a while back about you following Dave Ramsey's financial principles, speaking of getting rid of debt and holding on to cash and things like that. Are you still doing that, and how's that working out for you? What's your personal financial approach right now?
Well, we've talked about going back to the envelope system. We do not use it. We do use debit cards and so forth. But actually, yeah, we're still aggressively paying down debt, building up our emergency fund. We've now paid off our car loans and are now almost done with student loans. And so we've started paying down the mortgage a little bit. So yeah, we actually are trying to stay as debt-free as possible, which is unusual in America. And I've had these conversations with people where they say, well, why would you want to pay off your house when you could be investing it at a higher return? And I think the answer is that it gives you a feeling of safety, and especially in times like this, I don't even know what my investment return looks like. My house, I know I can keep living in.
Well, I think that's good advice, and I think that more people should listen, and particularly the people in Washington who are running things ought to be thinking about, paring down debt and building up an emergency fund and all of that. But I'm not nearly as optimistic on that. And Dave Ramsey says he won't run for president, so.
You're down in Tennessee. Send Dave Ramsey up to talk to the Congress.
That would be fun, but I don't know that they'd listen. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to us. It's always great to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it as always.
Thanks. And that's Megan McArdle. She's business and economics editor at The Atlantic, and she's a long-term libertarian econo-blogger. Visit her at meganmcardle.theatlantic.com and read everything she has to say about this. We'll be back next week here on InstaVision. Until then, take care and have fun on the internet. Thanks.